Science fiction has always been one of those genres that the more I read of it, the more I want to read of it. And this month, I finally read a science fiction book that's been sitting on my TBR for years. Hello everyone, welcome back to Tall Guy Reads. My name is Alex, and today we are going to be talking about and reviewing Hyperion by Dan Simmons. Before we dive into this review, I do want to briefly mention that this is going to be an entirely spoiler-free review, and I'm really mainly doing that because I truly think that so many people could benefit from reading Hyperion. I don't think this is, just for science fiction fans or fantasy fans even at all. I really think that what this book talks about when it comes to the human experience could apply to any single living person on the planet if they just sit down and take the time to read it. So yeah, with all that said, let's dive into the review, starting with what is Hyperion by Dan Simmons about. Hyperion is a 1989 novel by Dan Simmons that takes place about 1,000 years into the future, where an organization known as the Hegemony of Man controls hundreds of planets, all connected by what are called Farcaster portals. Now, there's a fragile alliance between the Hegemony of Man and the Technocore, which is a civilization of AIs, and the Ousters, a modified group of humans, are living amongst the stars, engaged in conflict with the Hegemony. Numerous outback planets have no Farcasters and cannot be accessed without incurring significant time dilation. One of these planets is Hyperion, home to structures known as the Time Tombs, which are moving backward in time and guarded by a legendary creature known as the Shrike. On the eve of an Ouster invasion of Hyperion, a final pilgrimage to the Time Tombs has been organized, consisting of 7 pilgrims, but there is a twist thrown into this whole setup in that one of these pilgrims is an enemy spy, and you are not sure who it is. Along the journey, each of these pilgrims decide that they will tell their story about what their past is, what connects them with Hyperion, why are they chosen for this pilgrimage, and why they want to return to Hyperion and to, in turn, the Shrike and the Time Tombs. This is essentially what book 1 is. Hyperion, the first book in the Hyperion duology and the Hyperion Cantos, is all about these pilgrims' tales. Shifting continuously from one pilgrim's tale to another while effortlessly moving the plot forward as the pilgrims get closer and closer to their destination, Hyperion is an absolutely staggering piece of speculative fiction that manages to provide a lot of very thought-provoking commentary on life, death, mortality, religion, literature, war, sex, and more, while also capturing the horror, adventure, and fascination that makes this, an absolutely classic science fiction book that manages to transcend any conventional definition that you may have of what science fiction is, while at the same time representing the very best of what that genre can be. Right off the bat, I think the best place to start when it comes to talking about Hyperion is talking about the actual narrative structure of the book itself, because at its core, Hyperion is a compilation of a bunch of different novellas or long short stories that each represent each individual pilgrim's tale as they tell you why they're returning to the planet Hyperion, and in turn, why they're returning and looking to return to the Time Tombs and the mysterious figure known as the Shrike. Honestly, I think one of the biggest reasons why I haven't committed to actually picking up Hyperion until now, despite it being on my TBR for years, is actually just the fact that, I knew that this was basically a bunch of short stories, and I'm not super well versed in short stories, and I wasn't super inclined to pick it up because of that. But wow, after finishing this book, I am so frustrated at myself because this absolutely blew away all expectations I could have ever possibly had. This may be a compilation of a bunch of different short stories at its core, but it really does not feel like that. This feels like a huge continuous narrative. And yes, you are spending 50 to 100 pages at a time with each individual character as they tell you their story of how they got there or why they're returning to Hyperion, or even their story within a story. But at the same time, the plot is still progressing. The characters are moving forward and closer to their destination of the Time Tombs on Hyperion, and that doesn't stop. I think all of this just allows just something that feels like a very cohesive narrative with individual short stories within it, and it's just unlike anything I've ever experienced when reading a book that was essentially a bunch of different short stories. Now, obviously talking about the narrative execution of Hyperion would only be part of the picture unless we talked about Dan Simmons' writing style. This is my first Dan Simmons novel, and I am so happy that Hyperion is my first Dan Simmons novel, but one of the first things I noticed when reading Hyperion is just how visual of a writer Dan Simmons is. Whether it's a place, whether it's a creature like the Shrike, whether it's a setting, or just the actual descriptions of different people or anything that he's creating in this world, in this future of ours, the space, the planets around it, and the history that each of these individual, pilgrims are telling. it's just so visual, and it's so unique because I'm not the most visual reader. I don't visualize every single thing I'm reading, but this was some of the most crystal clear visual imagery that I have ever read in science fiction specifically. The thing though, in Hyperion, Dan Simmons does not do this through extensively long descriptions or anything like that, or just wasted word choice or anything where it would feel like you're just reading a lot to get a little, just in terms of the imagery. No, in fact, I would say all of the imagery is executed through word choice and sentence construction, and it's just stunning to me because I really was just blown away by just how visual all of these stories were as I was reading Hyperion. It was just one of the more unique reading experiences I've had in that way in quite some time. On the whole, I found Dan Simmons' writing style and his prose within Hyperion to be very readable and digestible, full of very vivid imagery that allowed him to explore what truly separates Hyperion from any other science fiction book that I've read in a long, long time: the Pilgrims themselves and their tales. Hyperion focuses entirely on the Pilgrims and their tales. As each Pilgrim tells you their story, you learn more about them, why they're there, and within just a couple of dozen pages, you just all of a sudden get this well-developed character that you know way more about than you did at the start of the book. Additionally, as I said earlier, right from the start, you're told that one of these pilgrims is a spy. So throughout each of these pilgrims' tales, I was constantly trying to dissect everything that they were saying in order to figure out who it was. So even if it was a pilgrim that I wasn't as invested in as another one, the entire time that they were telling their tale, I was just looking for clues to figure out maybe they're the spy, or trying to figure out who the spy could be. Furthermore, the individual tales themselves were some of the most memorable stories that I have read in a long, long time. And a few of them specifically absolutely astounded me by what Dan Simmons was able to do within 50 to 100 pages while telling these individual stories. Whether it absolutely terrified me or completely broke my heart or enlightened me or depressed me, the emotional impact of these stories within Hyperion was more intense than many full-length novels that I've read that had tried to do the same thing. That being said, the two stories that absolutely hit me on an emotional level and resonated with me more than I could have ever possibly expected going into Hyperion were The Scholar and The Priest. And I'm not going to go into very specific detail on these with you right now, just because I feel like half the fun of Hyperion is really going in as blind as possible and just embracing the story for what it is and fully immersing yourself in everything of what's to come as the pilgrims are telling you their story. But the first story that you were given in Hyperion, the first pilgrim that tells their tale, is the priest. And oh my God, was this an unbelievable way to start this book. Father Hoyt's tale explores religion, but also loops in plenty of commentary on time and mortality. And the combination of these themes, along with the adventures of Father Hoyt and his mentor, Father DeRay, and just some of the most incredibly stunning visual imagery that I have ever read in a short story, made this a story that I absolutely have not stopped thinking about since I finished it. This is probably my favorite story within Hyperion, just because this is the one that absolutely truly resonated with me more than any of the other ones within the story, but that could absolutely change as I go back and visit these on a reread. But before starting this book, I had heard nothing but how devastating and how unforgettable The Scholar's Tale is, and yeah, they weren't far off. Simply put, this is one of the heaviest pieces of short story fiction I have ever read. Looping in themes such as religion, time, mortality, age, identity, and so on, The Scholar's Tale particularly explores so many unbelievably dense and complicated issues in a way that makes it stand out from any single story that I've read that has attempted to do the same. And I believe that, even if you're not truly motivated to read Hyperion on the whole, I would say almost read it just for The Scholar's Tale, because I really think that just this is an incredibly emotional piece of writing that will resonate with you one way or the other, and especially depending on where you are in your life, because I truly think that The Scholar's Tale is just, again, it's one of the best pieces of short story writing that I have ever read in my life. Overall, the individual Pilgrim's tales were absolutely astonishing, and I truly stand by my belief that every living person on this planet should read Hyperion, because I think that they would benefit in one way or the other from these tales. And whichever tale they associate with might totally vary on their experiences, where they are in life, how old they are, and so on. But I think you absolutely have something to gain by reading Hyperion and just exploring what it talks about when it comes to talking about the human experience and everything regarding mortality, time, life, death, religion, age, war, sex, and more. The next point I want to briefly touch on is the world building, because in the novel Hyperion, I find it to be actually incredibly unique. Dan Simmons, as I said multiple times throughout this review, has an incredible ability to paint a picture of what he's writing, whether it's a setting or a person or a place or just, the universe overall. I never got the idea that I couldn't picture what he was writing when he was writing the stories of Hyperion. On top of that, one of the biggest presences in this book is the Shrike, and this is one of the most fascinating and also terrifying at the same time creatures that I've ever read about in a science fiction book. And it brings up so many different questions that I want answered, and I don't know if these will be answered in later books, but I have so many questions about the Shrike and its purpose and its existence after reading this first book. I mean, why is it there? Who created it? What are its origins? Is it a friend? Is it a foe? Is it our enemy? Is it there trying to hurt us? Is it there trying to help us? Why is it even there to begin with? And I'm really curious to just learn more about the Shrike as we move forward in the books, especially in Fall of Hyperion. I think we'll get maybe a little bit more information. But the Shrike is one of the most visually stunning and also absolutely thought-provoking and mentally fascinating creatures I've ever read about in a fantasy and science fiction book. Now, the big potential con when it comes to the world building in Hyperion is that right off the bat, Dan Simmons just kind of tosses you in there. I mean, right on the first couple of pages of this book, you get thrown term after term, organization after organization, a lot of science fiction, techno jargon that will really, might seem very jarring to you just coming into this book. And I think this can absolutely be a con for a lot of people, and I totally see why it would be. A lot of authors might provide definitions or explanations of what these terms or organizations are throughout the narrative, or even include a glossary in the back for you to reference as you're making your way through the book. Dan Simmons kind of does neither of those, at least to start with, and I really think that a tip that I can give for anyone who's starting off Hyperion is to just trust Dan Simmons. He knows what he's doing, and I really think that at its core, Hyperion is a character-driven story, and the story is about the Pilgrims and the exploration of the human experience while going through each of their individual tales. Yes, it is a science fiction book with a lot of fantastical elements that are thrown in there throughout the story, in the setting, that play huge parts in the stories themselves. But you will learn these as you make your way through. And I really think that if you just, take them for what they are to begin with, and you're like, yeah, this might be a little bit jarring, but I'm just going to roll with it, you will find that by the end of this book, especially maybe even way before that, you'll be in a much better place. Now, in addition to the potentially jarring introduction to some of the world building elements in Hyperion, I am going to briefly touch on a few cons that I think exist within the book, but at the same time, there really aren't many. But the first one is that, there are 6 or 7 pilgrims telling their stories within the book of Hyperion. And because of that, the chances that they all land the same for you are very low. And they didn't for me. There were definitely some that absolutely were just didn't resonate with me at all compared to some of the peak ones in the story. But I definitely think that the best part about Hyperion is just how rereadable it is. I really think that the story within Hyperion could be reread over and over and over the course of your life, because I truly think that whatever point in your life that you are at, you may find things to connect with in a different Pilgrim story than someone else would. And what I found so enlightening and really that resonated with me a lot when it came to the priest story and the scholar's tale, you may find about the detective's tale or the soldier's tale or something like that. So I definitely think that while this absolutely is a con, and that the consistency factor of the storytelling throughout the book, I don't think this is as dramatic as it seems, because I did enjoy all the stories. There were just some that were absolutely standout, some of the best fiction I've ever read, and there were some that were just meh, okay. But at the end of the day, I really had a great time reading these stories. The other big one is, and this is not entirely a con, but I definitely think that you should know that Hyperion is absolutely a part 1. And I really think that you should go in planning to read at least book 2 as well, The Fall of Hyperion, to get the full story and to really understand everything that's going to happen, at least for the characters that exist within this first book. While I think this could be read on its own, and I know plenty of people who have read Hyperion on its own as a standalone book itself and have been totally happy with that and have had no intention of going back to read The Fall of Hyperion or anything like that. For me, I found the ending of this book to be a little bit irritating in the fact that, I definitely want part 2 and I definitely need to know what happens next. So for me, the fact that it's split kind of detracted from my reading experience a little bit, but not that much, because I am going to be reading The Fall of Hyperion this month and I have all 4 books. So for me, I'll just keep reading them until I really get the full story, because I really want to know what happens next. So this isn't, really a con, but it definitely could detract from some people's reading experience if they go in thinking this is an absolute standalone standalone science fiction book that you don't need to read anything after that, because I really would probably say you probably would want to, at least I definitely do, after reading book 1. Now, should you read Hyperion? Yes, absolutely. I think whether you consider yourself a primarily fantasy reader or primarily a science fiction reader or even a mystery reader or a nonfiction reader, I don't think it matters whatsoever. I think every single living person on this planet has something to gain by reading Hyperion by Dan Simmons. And I think the themes that are explored within this book and the exploration of the human experience are something that is provided one of the most thought-provoking reading experiences that I've had in quite some time. And I truly have not been able to stop thinking about it since. And this absolutely will push this to be, probably one of my favorite science fiction books of all time for that very reason in and of itself. Hyperion is an absolute masterclass of storytelling, and the combination of the themes and the writing and the characters and the messages that are explored within this book, along with the incredibly vivid imagery that I just can't get out of my head, made this probably one of the best science fiction books that I have ever read. And I'm truly astounded by what Dan Simmons was able to do within 50 to 60 to 100 pages with each one of these Pilgrims tales, and just how much of an emotional impact some of these tales had that was so much more than what most full-length novels that attempt to do the same thing have been able to do. Through his writing in Hyperion, Dan Simmons was able to evoke for me feelings of curiosity, wonder, happiness, frustration, sadness, horror, and more on a scale that I found to be so incredibly memorable. And I absolutely loved this book, and I guarantee you and I promise you that I will be rereading Hyperion and probably the rest of the Hyperion Cantos multiple times over the remaining course of my life. But that is my review for Hyperion by Dan Simmons. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoy this content. If you do, please think about subscribing, hitting that bell notification down below if you want to get updates of new videos as they come out. Hitting that like button helps me out, helps the channel out a lot, and I really appreciate it. But with all that said, I hope you guys have a fantastic day.